welcome again to Noetic Resonance. This week, our sponsor is me. I'm just kidding. This episode was brought to you by me, and if my work resonates with you, I appreciate any donations or anybody who would like to contribute to furthering my research and bringing this content to you. I have links on noeticresonance.org. That's just the spelling of the podcast name, ending in .org. On that website, if you scroll down on the first page, there is links there that you can donate to my PayPal or Venmo or Cash App. I welcome whatever. If it resonates and you want to donate, thank you. Now, today we are going into territory that is deeply personal, theologically rich, and for some of you, exactly what you've been waiting for someone to say out loud. This episode is about deliverance and sacred anger, two things that the spiritual community has either sensationalized, sanitized, or suppressed. We're going to do neither. We're going to talk about it honestly, from experience, from lineage, and from a place of genuine authority. Before we go further, I want to offer a disclaimer as always. This episode contains my personal testimony, including generational trauma, suicide loss, and spiritual warfare. If any of those topics are tender for you today, please take care of yourself first. You can always come back to this episode when you're ready. There's no rush on healing work. What I share here comes from lived experience, spiritual discernment, and years of doing this work. It's not a replacement for professional mental health support, and I always encourage both. The sacred and the clinical can and should work together. All right, let's go. What is deliverance? Deliverance at its core is simply this: the removal of what doesn't belong. It's the process of freeing a person, a family, or a lineage from spiritual oppression, bondage, or influences that have taken up residence where they were never invited, and in some cases where an agreement was made, consciously or not. This is where it gets nuanced. Not everything that oppresses us arrived uninvited. Soul contracts do exist, as we've spoken of in my previous episodes. Agreements made before this incarnation or during it that allowed certain energies, entities, or patterns access to our lineage or our lives. Sometimes these contracts were made out of love, a soul agreeing to contain something until someone with the capacity to deal with it finally arrived. Sometimes they were made out of desperation, ignorance, or manipulation. The origin matters less than the recognition. If a contract no longer serves your highest good and the good of those connected to you, it can be broken. Authority supersedes agreement when wielded with love and clarity. The concept isn't new, and it isn't exclusive to any one tradition. Every spiritual tradition across human history has recognized that people can carry things that aren't theirs: attachments, agreements, generational patterns, entities, curses, and those things can and should be removed by someone with the authority and discernment to do so. In modern Western Christianity, deliverance became heavily associated with dramatic exorcism, largely thanks to Hollywood, but that's a narrow and sensationalized slice of something much older and much more nuanced. Indigenous traditions have practiced it. Eastern traditions have practices for it. Shamanic traditions built entire frameworks around it. What they all shared is this recognition. Humans are spiritual beings operating in a spiritual reality, and sometimes that reality includes influences that bind, oppress, and diminish. Deliverance work is simply the work of setting the captive free. Before any deliverance work can be done effectively, the most important question to answer is, what are we actually working with here? Because not everything that oppresses a person is the same kind of thing, and treating one thing as though it's another is like prescribing the wrong medicine. It may not help, and it could make things worse. This is where discernment becomes the foundation of everything else. Discernment is not guesswork, and it is not assumption. It is a developed sensitivity to what is actually present, what is operating, what has legal ground, and what doesn't. It comes through prayer, through patience, through the development of spiritual perception over time, and through a genuine relationship with the Holy Spirit, or however you understand the divine intelligence that reveals what is hidden. There are several distinct things that can be in operation when someone comes to you for deliverance work. A generational bloodline agreement is something inherited through the family line, as we'll discuss in depth shortly. It operates across generations and affects multiple family members and and recognizable patterns. A soul contract is an agreement made consciously or unconsciously, either before this incarnation or during it, that gave something access. These feel different from generational agreements because they carry a sense of personal ownership even when the person didn't fully understand what they were agreeing to. An entity attachment is something that has attached to a person's field, often through trauma, addiction, occult involvement, extreme emotional states, or prolonged exposure to dark environments. These are distinct presences that are not part of the person's own energy but have latched on and are feeding on them. A trauma response with a spiritual component looks like what medicine would call a mental health condition, but has something operating underneath or alongside it that is spiritual in nature. These require particular care because the clinical and the spiritual components both need to be addressed, and neither can be ignored in favor of the other. Something purely psychological or medical that has no spiritual root at all, this is also a real possibility, and discernment means being honest when what someone needs is a therapist or a doctor rather than a deliverance minister. Misidentifying a medical condition as a spiritual oppression can cause serious harm. So how do you begin to discern which of these you're dealing with? You start with prayer and stillness before any conversation about the specifics. Ask for revelation about what is actually present before the person's story fills the room and influences your perception. Ask questions that reveal patterns. How long has this been happening? Does it run in the family? When did it start and what was happening in your life at that time? Have you ever been involved in practices that opened spiritual doors? These answers begin to paint a picture. Pay attention to what you feel in your own body and spirit as you sit with the person. Discernment often comes through the minister's own physical and spiritual sensations before it comes through cognitive understanding. Be honest about what you don't know as well. Saying, I need more time to discern this, or this is outside my area of expertise, is not weakness. It is integrity, and it protects the person in front of you from well-intentioned but misdirected ministry. Discernment is not a one-size-fits-all checklist. It is a living, relational, prayerful process and is the foundation upon which all effective deliverance work is built. Hollywood has done enormous damage to our understanding of what spiritual affliction actually looks like, and nowhere is that damage more evident than in the confusion between oppression and possession. Because of movies like The Exorcist and countless others, most people picture possession when they think of demonic or spiritual affliction. Spinning heads, unnatural voices, superhuman strength, complete loss of the person's own consciousness and will, and while extreme cases of full possession do exist and are documented across cultures and throughout history, they are genuinely rare. What the vast majority of people experiencing spiritual affliction are dealing with is oppression, not possession, and the difference matters enormously. Possession in its truest sense involves a significant displacement or suppression of the person's own will and consciousness by an outside presence. The person loses agency. They may have no memory of what happened during an episode. Their personality, voice, and behavior change dramatically in ways that feel wholly other. This is the extreme end of the spectrum, and it typically involves prolonged, deliberate, and significant opening of spiritual doors over time. Oppression is far more common and far more nuanced. In oppression, the person remains themselves. Their will is intact, their consciousness is present, but something is pressing on them from the outside or has attached to their field in a way that influences their thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and physical well-being without fully overriding their personhood. Oppression can feel like a heaviness that never fully lifts, intrusive thoughts that don't feel like your own, compulsions towards behaviors you don't actually want, persistent fear, rage, shame, or despair that seems disproportionate to your circumstances, a sense of being watched or followed, physical symptoms that have no medical explanation, dreams that are consistently dark or disturbing, or feeling drained of energy in ways that rest doesn't resolve. Do any of those sound familiar? They should, because oppression is extraordinarily common, and most people experiencing it have no framework to understand what is happening to them. The good news about oppression is that because the person's will remains intact, because they are still themselves underneath what is pressing on them, the work of deliverance is entirely possible and often remarkably effective. The person's own authority, activated and engaged, is one of the most powerful forces available in addressing oppression. This is why the personal participation piece we'll discuss shortly is so critical. In oppression, the person is never helpless. They always have agency. They always have the capacity to choose differently, to exercise authority, to participate in their own freedom. What they often lack is the knowledge that this is possible and someone to show them how. Understanding whether you are dealing with oppression or possession also determines how you approach the work, who should be involved, and what level of preparation and protection is necessary, and what the reasonable expectations for the session are. Most of what you will encounter in pastoral deliverance work is oppression. Take it seriously, address it with authority, and know that the person in front of you is never as far gone as the enemy wants them to believe they are. One of the most misunderstood aspects of deliverance work is that not everything you're carrying originated with you. Some of what you're fighting isn't even yours. Generational bondage is real. It operates through bloodlines passed from one generation to the next like an inheritance nobody asked for. Patterns of addiction, abuse, mental illness, poverty, premature death, broken relationships. When you see the same wounds cycling through the family across generations, that is rarely coincidence. That is a bloodline agreement at work. These agreements weren't necessarily made by you. They may have been made by an ancestor generations back, through occult involvement, through a vow made in desperation, through trauma that opened a door, through deliberate invitation or profound ignorance. It doesn't matter how far back it goes. Until it is revoked with authority, it remains active. The bloodline carries it forward, and each generation inherits both the wound and the responsibility it wasn't told it had. This is why you can do everything right, therapy, inner work, healthy choices, and still feel like something is pulling against you. Like there's a ceiling you can't break through. Like the same storm keeps finding your family no matter which direction you run. That's not weakness. That's a contract still in effect. The good news is, and this is the part that changes everything, is that contracts can be broken. Bloodline agreements made in darkness can be revoked in light. It only takes one person in a lineage with the awareness and the authority to stand up and say, "This ends with me." One person. That's all it takes to change the trajectory for everyone who comes after. You may be that person. You may be exactly why you were born into the family you were born into. We've talked about agreements that were made consciously through desperation, ignorance, or manipulation. We've talked about agreements made before this lifetime through soul contracts. But there is another kind of agreement that is perhaps the most common and least recognized: silence. Silence is not neutrality. In the spiritual realm, silence in the face of what is operating is itself a position. It is a passive agreement. It is the door left open because no one ever thought to close it. Think about what this looks like in real life. A family where something dark has been happening for generations and nobody talks about it. Where the abuse is known but unnamed. Where the addict is visible but unaddressed. Where the pattern is recognized but everyone keeps quietly accepting it as just how things are in the family. That silence is not innocence. That silence is agreement. When you sweep things under the rug, you are agreeing for this to continue. When we do not name what is operating, we give it permission to continue. When we look away from what we know is there, we are not protecting ourselves. We are protecting it. This shows up in individual lives as well. The person who knows something has attached to them, who feels the weight of something that isn't theirs, who has even had others confirm what they're sensing. something, but who never takes authority over it because confronting it feels too big, too scary, or too uncertain. That avoidance is an agreement, not a conscious one, not a malicious one, but a real one nonetheless. Silence can also look like tolerating what should not be tolerated, accepting treatment from others that violate your dignity because speaking up feels dangerous or unkind. Every time we absorb what we should address, we are agreeing to carry it. Breaking the agreement of silence is often the first act of deliverance before any formal work ever begins. It is the moment someone says out loud for the first time, "Something is wrong here. Something has been operating in my family. I am not okay with this anymore." That naming is powerful. That naming is the first movement of sacred anger. And that naming changes the spiritual atmosphere before anything else is done. What have you been silent about that you were never meant to carry quietly? We've been sold a very specific image of what spiritual bondage looks like. Chains, darkness, possession, someone foaming at the mouth in a church pew. And while extreme manifestations do exist, the vast majority of people walking under generational bondage and curses look completely ordinary from the outside. Some of them even look successful. Some of them look absolutely fine because bondage doesn't always announce itself. It looks like the same relationship dynamic repeating in every generation. Abandonment, abuse, betrayal, always with different faces but the same wound. It looks like a family where addiction shows up in every generation without fail. Different substances, same compulsion, same destruction. It looks like financial patterns that never quite break no matter how hard people work, like a ceiling no one can get through. It looks like mental illness cycling through a bloodline, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation appearing in parent after parent, child after child. Not purely genetics, not purely circumstance, something running underneath both. It looks like premature death, accidents, violence, people leaving too soon in too many generations to be coincidence. It looks like chronic illness that medical science can treat but never fully resolve. It looks like a family that loves each other but keeps destroying each other anyway, like people trying their best and still repeating what they swore they never would. It looks like you wondering why you feel like something is always working against you, even when you're doing everything right. That is what bondage looks like in real life. Recognizable, familiar, sometimes so normalized within a family system that nobody questions it because it's just how things are in your family. That's exactly what generational agreements count on, that you'll call it genetics, bad luck, family dysfunction, mental illness, and never look underneath for the spiritual root that's been feeding all of it. So now that you can recognize what bondage looks like in real life, let's talk about what it looks like when it breaks. Because just like the bondage itself, deliverance rarely looks like what we've been shown. Hollywood gave us them spinning heads and levitation, and the church gave us screaming, writhing, and someone being pinned to the floor while a preacher shouts over them. And while I won't tell you dramatic manifestations never happen, because they do, that is not the standard, and it is not the requirement. That picture has actually done tremendous damage, like I said, because people either go looking for the drama as proof something is happening, or they dismiss the entire concept because it doesn't seem unhinged enough. Real deliverance can look like a conversation where truth is finally spoken over someone and you watch something visibly shift in their eyes, like a light coming back on. It can look like tears that come from somewhere deeper than emotion, something releasing that has been held for a very long time. It can look like a physical sensation, pressure lifting from the chest or shoulders, sudden warmth, feeling lighter in the body almost immediately. It can look like yawning, shaking, or deep involuntary breathing as the nervous system releases what it's been holding. It can look like someone finally getting angry enough to say no more and meaning it all the way down to their toes. It can be quiet. It can be quick. It can happen in someone's living room, in a parking lot, over a phone call. It doesn't require a church building, a specific denomination, or someone with a title. What it requires is authority, discernment, clarity about what is being addressed, and the willingness to stand in that authority without wavering. It also doesn't always happen in one session. Deep generational work especially can be layered. You may address one thing and find another underneath it. That's not failure. That's the nature of the root work. You keep going until it's done. And when it's done, you know. The person knows. Something that was present is no longer present. What was heavy is lighter. What was immovable begins to move. That's real deliverance, accessible, recognizable, and available to anyone walking in genuine authority. Before we talk about what you do for someone else, we need to talk about what you do for yourself, because deliverance work is not spiritually neutral for the person holding the space, and going in unprepared is not faith. It is foolishness. This is not said to create fear. It is said to create respect for what you are engaging with and responsibility for your own field before you open a door on behalf of someone else. Think of it this way. A surgeon scrubs in before an operation, not because scrubbing in makes them a surgeon, but because the preparation is part of the work. It protects the patient and it protects the surgeon. Deliverance ministry is no different. The preparation is not separate from the work. It is the foundation of it. So what does preparation and protection actually look like? Your own house needs to be in order. This doesn't mean you need to be perfect. It means you need to be honest. Unconfessed sin, unresolved offense, active agreement with darkness in your own life. These create vulnerabilities that can be exploited when you step into this kind of work. A regular practice of self-examination, confession, and repentance in whatever form is authentic to your tradition is essential maintenance for anyone doing this work consistently. Intentional prayer and covering before each session, not a quick prayer said out of habit, but a genuine and deliberate act of covering yourself, the person you are working with, and the space you are in with divine protection. You call in your spiritual support, your guides, your angels, the Holy Spirit, whatever language fits your framework. Be specific and intentional. Generic is not enough here. Next, know your authority and know its source. You are not operating in your own strength. The authority that moves in deliverance work is not yours by virtue of your personality, your intelligence, or your spiritual gifts. It flows through you from source. Knowing this keeps you humble and keeps you safe. The minister who begins to believe the authority is their own has opened a door of pride that creates real vulnerability. Next, establish clear spiritual boundaries for the session. State clearly, aloud if possible, what is and is not permitted in this space. Invite only what serves the highest good of the person you are working with. Make clear that nothing is permitted to transfer, attach, or follow anyone out of this space when the work is complete. These declarations are not performative. They are real spiritual parameters being set. Ground yourself before and after. Your physical body matters in this work. Feet on the ground, breath moving, body present and centered. Deliverance work can pull your awareness in many directions, and staying anchored in your own physical body keeps you stable and in your own lane throughout the session. Then cleanse and close the space when you are done, whether through prayer, through burning herbs, through sound, through whatever practice is authentic to your tradition. The space where this work was done needs to be intentionally cleared and closed after the session. What was stirred up needs to be addressed and the space returned to neutral. Care for yourself after significant sessions. This cannot be emphasized enough. Deliverance work is spiritually, emotionally, and physically taxing even when it goes well. Rest is not optional. Time in nature, in prayer, in silence, in the company of people who restore rather than drain you, these are not luxuries. They are maintenance for someone doing this level of work sustainably. And finally, know when to call for backup. If you encounter something in a session that exceeds your experience or your authority, stopping and seeking support from someone with greater experience in that specific area is not failure. It is wisdom. No single minister is equipped for every situation, and knowing your limits protects both you and the person you are serving. You cannot pour from an empty vessel, and you cannot hold a door open for someone else's freedom if your own field is compromised. Preparation is not optional. It is the first act of love toward the person sitting across from you. There is one more thing that must be said before we move forward, and it cannot be skipped. Deliverance cannot be done to someone. It must be done with them. No matter how skilled the minister, no matter how strong the authority operating through them, no matter how clearly the bondage is identified, if the person being delivered is not ready, is not willing, is not a full and active participant in their own freedom, the work cannot be completed. Or if it appears to be completed, it will not hold. This is not a loophole. This is not a failure of the minister or the process. This is spiritual law. Free will is sovereign. one. It is given by the Creator, and it is not overridden, not by darkness and not by light. A person has to want to be free. They have to be willing to release what has been familiar, even when what is familiar has been destroying them. Sometimes bondage becomes an identity. Sometimes it becomes a comfort in its own twisted way. Sometimes people simply are not ready yet, and that has to be honored. What this means practically is that your role as someone doing this work is never to force, manipulate, or override another person's process. You can hold space. You can offer truth. You can stand in authority over what is operating, but the door has to be opened from the inside. When someone is truly ready, you will know. And when that readiness meets prepared authority, that is when the walls come down. And there is one more thing that activates that authority in a way nothing else quite can. Let's talk about anger, real anger. Because if you grew up in the church or in certain spiritual communities, you were probably taught that anger is ungodly, that a truly spiritual person rises above it, that if you're angry, you need to pray more, forgive faster, and get back to being peaceful as quickly as possible. That teaching has kept more people in bondage than almost anything else I can think of, because there is a kind of anger that is not only acceptable, it is necessary, it is sacred, and without it, certain chains simply do not break. Sacred anger is not the same as toxic anger. Let's be clear about that distinction because it matters. Toxic anger is reactive. It's wounded ego defending itself. It lashes out. It destroys indiscriminately. It seeks to harm. It comes from a place of powerlessness masquerading as power. We've all felt it, and most of us have acted from it at some point in our lives. That is not what we're talking about. Sacred anger is different in its origin and its quality entirely. Sacred anger is what rises in you when something in your spirit recognizes a genuine violation of yourself, of someone you love, of divine order. It is clarity, not chaos. It is focused, not scattered. It knows exactly what it's addressing and does not waver. It doesn't seek to harm. It seeks to correct, to restore, and to enforce what is right. It is the part of you that finally says, enough. This ends now, not on my watch and not in my lineage. That is sacred anger, and it is one of the most powerful forces available to anyone doing deliverance work. The suppression of anger as a spiritual virtue didn't come from the divine. It came from institutions that understood something important. An angry person who knows their authority is very difficult to control. Think about that for a moment. A congregation that has been taught that anger is sinful, that forgiveness means immediate peace, that righteous people don't raise their voices, that is a congregation that will absorb a great deal without pushing back, that would stay in abusive systems longer than they should, that will call their own legitimate outrage a spiritual failure and repent of it. The suppression of anger has been one of the most effective tools of religious control in human history. But look across traditions that predate or exist outside that framework, and you'll find something completely different. In the Hindu tradition, Shiva is one of the principal deities, a god of transformation whose role includes destruction. But his destruction is not evil or random. It is purposeful. Shiva destroys what is no longer serving so that new creation can emerge from the ashes. His anger is a cosmic cleaning force. Without it, nothing new can be born. Kali, from the Hindu tradition, is his counterpart in many ways. A fierce goddess depicted with a fearsome appearance, weapons in hand, standing over what she has conquered. She looks terrifying to those who misunderstand her. But in her tradition, she is a liberator. She destroys ego, illusion, and evil so that the soul can go free. Her ferocity is an act of love. From ancient Egypt, we have Sekhmet, a lioness goddess of war and healing simultaneously. When divine order was violated, Sekhmet was sent to restore it. She was not gentle about it. The Egyptians understood that sometimes restoration requires a force that doesn't negotiate with what needs to be removed. The Bhagavad Gita, always thank you for your patience with my pronunciations, is one of Hinduism's most sacred texts. It gives us the story of Arjuna, a great warrior who stands on a battlefield facing an army that includes his own family members and teachers. He freezes. He cannot bring himself to fight. He tells the god Krishna he would rather die than cause this destruction. And Krishna's response is extraordinary. He doesn't comfort Arjuna's reluctance. He doesn't validate his desire to lay down his weapons and make peace. He tells him to stand up. to fulfill his sacred duty as a warrior, that shrinking from righteous action in the face of genuine evil is not virtue. It is a failure of dharma. It is a failure of sacred responsibility. And even within the Christian tradition, the evidence is right there for anyone willing to look. Honestly, Jesus, who is held up as the ultimate model of gentleness and peace, walked into the temple in Jerusalem and found it had been turned into a marketplace. Money changers and merchants doing business in a sacred place. And Jesus didn't quietly ask them to please consider relocating. He made a whip. He turned over their tables. He drove them out with force. He was furious, and he acted from that fury with complete authority and zero apology. That was sacred anger, modeled by the one Christians call Lord. The anger was never the problem. What it was aimed at and what it was rooted in, that's what determines whether anger is sacred or destructive. We've established what sacred anger is. Now let's talk about what it actually does in the context of deliverance work, because this is the piece that most teaching leaves out entirely. Authority in the spiritual realm is not theoretical. It is not a title you hold or a position you were given by an institution. It is not determined by how long you've been in ministry or how many certificates hang on your wall. Spiritual authority is activated, and one of its most powerful activators is sacred anger. Here's why. Bondage, generational or otherwise, operates on agreement. It stays where it is allowed to stay. It continues where it has not been firmly and finally addressed. It counts on passivity. It counts on confusion. It counts on the person it's oppressing not fully realizing their own authority or being too beaten down to exercise it. When someone rises in sacred anger, genuine, focused, rooted in truth and love for what is right, something shifts in the spiritual atmosphere. It is a declaration. It is a line being drawn. It is a soul saying with every fiber of its being, you do not have permission to be here anymore. That declaration carries weight that polite prayers often do not. This is not about volume. This is not about emotion for its own sake. You can speak quietly and still carry devastating authority. What matters is the quality of what is behind the words, the absolute refusal to accept what has been accepted for generations, the knowing, not hoping, not asking, the knowing that what you are addressing has to go. Sacred anger cuts through the fog of oppression. It cuts through the familiar numbness that bondage creates. It wakes something up in the person being delivered. Their own spirit recognizing that this is the moment, that this time is different, that the one standing before them means it completely. And that recognition, that meeting of prepared authority with sacred anger is where chains break. It is not the minister's anger alone that does the work. Remember what we said earlier. The person being delivered must be a full participant. When their sacred anger rises to meet yours, when they find that place in themselves that finally says enough, that is when the most profound and lasting deliverance happens. Two fires meeting, and what was binding them both burns away. Sometimes you do everything right though. The person is willing and participating fully. The authority is genuine. The sacred anger is present. The work is done with clarity and intention, and yet something persists. Something remains. I want to normalize this before anything else, because the temptation when this happens is to conclude that the work failed, that you did something wrong, that the person isn't truly free, or that deliverance simply doesn't work. None of those conclusions are necessarily true. Here is what persistent resistance after genuine deliverance work usually means. There are layers. Deep generational work, especially, rarely dissolves in a single session. What you addressed was real and it moved, but underneath it was something older, something more foundational that is now visible precisely because the first layer has been cleared. This is not failure. This is the nature of root work. You keep going. There is an open door that hasn't been identified yet. Something still has legal ground. This could be an unbroken soul contract, an unconfessed agreement, unforgiveness towards someone specific, an ongoing behavior or relationship that is feeding what you're trying to remove, or a belief system that is actively re-inviting what was just addressed. The work of discernment here is to ask, what is this still holding onto and why? The person needs additional support alongside the spiritual work. Sometimes what looks like persistent spiritual oppression has a psychological or physiological component that also needs clinical attention. Trauma stored in the nervous system, untreated mental illness, addiction still active, these can create conditions that make deliverance work difficult to sustain. The sacred and the clinical working together is not a compromise. It is wisdom. The timing is not yet complete can also be the issue. Some work unfolds over time rather than in a single moment. The seeds of freedom have been planted and they are growing even when you cannot see it yet. This requires discernment to distinguish from other possibilities because it can be used to rationalize inaction. But it is also genuinely true in some cases. So here's what to do practically when something persists. You need to go back to discernment. Ask what still has permission here. Ask the person what they may have not fully surrendered. Look for the open door rather than repeating the same work over the same ground. Pray, seek counsel, and where needed, refer to someone with different gifts or greater experience in the specific area you're working in. Knowing when to refer is not weakness. It is integrity. You are not the answer to every situation, and recognizing that is part of walking in genuine authority rather than ego. The person who didn't get fully free in one session is not a failure. They are someone who needs more time, more layers addressed, or a different kind of support. Keep showing up for them with humility and persistence. Freedom is still possible. Don't give up on it just because it didn't come all at once. Deliverance is not the finish line either. It is the starting line. This is one of the most important things I can tell you and one of the most overlooked aspects of this work. What happens after the deliverance is as significant as the deliverance itself, because freedom has to be inhabited, practiced, and protected, or what was removed will find its way back. Jesus himself addressed this directly. He spoke of an unclean spirit that leaves a person, wanders, finds nowhere to rest, and returns to find the house empty, swept clean, and put in order. And it brings 7 others more wicked than itself. The house was clean, but it was empty. Nothing had moved in to occupy the space that was cleared. This is the principle of aftercare. The space that was occupied by bondage has to be intentionally filled with something life-giving, or it becomes a vacancy sign. So what does that look like practically? Identity work is essential. When something has been operating in a person's life for a long time, sometimes their entire life, they have often built their sense of self around it without realizing it. The anxiety that was also their hypervigilance, the depression that was also their sensitivity, the anger that was also their protection. When those things leave, the person sometimes doesn't know who they are without them. Intentional work around identity, around who am I now, is crucial in the weeks and months following deliverance. New agreements need to be made consciously. If silence was the old agreement, the new agreement is speaking truth. If passivity was the old agreement, the new agreement is active authority. If shame was the door, the new agreement is dignity. These new agreements don't just happen automatically. They have to be chosen deliberately and repeatedly until they become the new normal. Community also matters enormously in this season. Isolation after deliverance is dangerous. The person needs people around them who understand what happened, who can speak truth over them when the old patterns try to reassert themselves, and who will not inadvertently reinforce what was just removed. This is one of the reasons genuine spiritual community is not optional for people doing this level of work. Ongoing spiritual practice becomes non-negotiable. Prayer, meditation, scripture, whatever connects the person to source, needs to become a daily anchor, not an occasional visit. The cleared space needs to be continuously inhabited by the presence of the divine. You have to watch for the return. This is not fear-based living, it is wisdom. After significant deliverance work, there is often a period of testing where the old patterns try to reestablish themselves. Thoughts that sound like the old voice, situations that mirror old dynamics, relationships that carry familiar energy. Recognizing these for what they are, an attempt to reclaim lost ground, and responding with the same authority that broke the original bondage is part of consolidating your freedom. Celebrate the wins, though. This sounds simple, and it matters more than people realize. Marking what was broken, honoring the courage it took, acknowledging the change even when it's subtle. These acts of recognition anchor freedom in the body and the memory in ways that reinforce the new reality. Freedom is not a single moment. It is is a practice, a posture, and daily choice until the new way of being becomes more natural than the old one ever was. You did not come this far to go back. Steward what was won. And remember, your spirit can be free in an instant, but your nervous system may take a little longer to realize the war is over. Be patient with your body as it learns how to feel safe. And we need to talk about forgiveness because it is one of the most misunderstood and most avoided components of lasting deliverance work, and without it, many people find themselves cycling back to the same place they thought they had left. Let me be clear from the beginning about what forgiveness is not. It's not saying what happened was okay. It is not reconciliation with someone who has not changed. It is not pretending the harm didn't occur or minimizing its impact. It is not a feeling that you conjure up or a decision that erases the pain. It is not something you do for the person who hurt you. Those misunderstandings have caused more damage in the church and in spiritual communities than almost anything else I can think of, because they ask wounded people to perform an emotional state they cannot access and then tell them their inability to access it is a spiritual failure. Real forgiveness is none of those things. Forgiveness is a spiritual, legal act that closes a door. Here's why it matters in the context of deliverance work specifically. When we hold unforgiveness towards someone, we remain in a spiritual agreement with what was done to us. We are energetically tethered to the person, the event, and the wound in a way that keeps a door open. Not because we deserve what happened or because the person who harmed us deserves to be released from the accountability, but because the tether itself gives darkness legal ground to operate through the wound. Unforgiveness is one of the most common open doors that causes deliverance work not to hold. The work gets done, something is addressed and cleared, and then it comes back. And when you go looking for the open door, you find it there in the place where someone was never forgiven and the wound was never released. This is why forgiveness belongs in aftercare rather than a precondition to deliverance. Sometimes people cannot access genuine forgiveness until some of the spiritual weight has been lifted. Sometimes the deliverance itself creates enough relief and clarity that forgiveness becomes possible for the first time. Meet people where they are rather than demanding forgiveness as the price of admission to their own healing. What forgiveness actually looks like as a spiritual legal act is a conscious, deliberate declaration made between you and the divine rather than between you and the person who harmed you. It sounds something like this. I choose to release this person's name from the debt I have held against them. I release the right to collect what they owe me. I close the door that their actions opened in my life, and I take back the ground that unforgiveness has given to darkness. This does not mean what they did was acceptable. It means I am no longer willing to be tethered to it. That declaration does not require the other person to be present. It does not require them to apologize or change. It does not require you to feel warmth towards them or invite them back into your life. It is an internal spiritual act of releasing a debt for your own freedom rather than for theirs. Forgiveness of self also belongs here and is often the harder work. The things we did in our own bondage, the ways we harmed ourselves and others while something was operating through us, those also need to be consciously released. Self-condemnation is its own open door and will undermine freedom as surely as unforgiveness towards others. This is not a one-time act for deep wounds either. It may need to be returned to repeatedly as new layers of the injury surface. That is not a sign that you didn't do it right the first time. It is a sign that the wound has depth and that healing is working its way through it layer by layer. Forgiveness does not always feel like relief immediately. Sometimes it feels like releasing something you were gripping tightly without realizing it, and the absence of that grip is disorienting before it becomes freeing. Trust the process even when the feeling doesn't follow the decision immediately. Close the door, release the debt, take back the ground. That is what forgiveness is, and that is why it belongs at the heart of every lasting deliverance. I want to get personal with you now, though, because everything I just taught you isn't a theory for me. It's my life. It's my family. It's blood and bone and years of walking through something none of us had a name for. The bondage I've been describing ran through my lineage visibly and violently. Suicidal ideations and attempts didn't visit my family once. They visited generation after generation. My mother battled it, I battled it, my daughter battled it, and my sister, my beautiful sister Beth. was lost to it. But I want to paint you a picture of what this actually looked like in real life, because it didn't look like a horror movie. It looked like a woman wandering aimlessly for hours, staring at a bush for hours, lost somewhere inside herself that nobody could reach. That was my sister. That was the face of what was operating in my bloodline. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a woman being slowly consumed from the inside while everyone around her tried to understand what they were looking at. That is what severe spiritual oppression can look like. Recognize it. My nephew Devin grew up inside the same darkness, tortured his whole life by something that had been running in our family long before he was born. He didn't ask for it. None of us did. There was no original agreement we could point to, just a lineage that had been open to this long enough that it had taken up deep residence and claimed casualties along the way. A few weeks ago, Devin did something that I can only describe as one of the bravest things I have witnessed. After a lifetime of being tortured, he made a conscious soul contract with Legion himself. Yes, that one. Not one, but many. He said he wanted peace for his soul, and in doing so, he became something remarkable, a container, a prison. He willingly bound what had been tormenting his family, holding it in place until someone with the experience and authority arrived to finish the work. He didn't have a choice about being born into this. He made a choice about how it would end, though. So we gathered and we did the work that Devin had made possible. And what happened in that room was undeniable. When the bondage broke, I felt it physically, in my body. A release that moved through me like something coiled tight for years, finally letting go. The energy in the room shifted so dramatically that someone present passed out. Not from fear, from the weight of what moved through the space. Legion was sent back to their creator. A generational curse that had claimed my sister, that had reached for me, that had reached for my daughter and my mother, was revoked. What Devin had been containing was finally dealt with. The line was clear. He has a baby coming in August. He is stepping into fatherhood in a freed lineage. That baby will not inherit what we inherited. That is what deliverance looks like in real life. This is why I do this work. Not from a book, not from a certificate, from a lineage that needed someone to finally stand up and say, this ends here. This ends with me. And if you're listening to this and you recognize your own family in what I've been describing today, I want you to know that one person is enough. You might be that person. You might be exactly why you were born into the family you were born into. Don't you dare shrink from that. Before I let you go today, I want to sit with you for just a moment. We covered a lot of ground. We talked about what deliverance actually is and what it isn't. We talked about the difference between what arrives uninvited and what we unknowingly agree to. We talked about bloodline agreements that bind entire families without their consent. We talked about what bondage actually looks like in real life. Not what Hollywood told you, but what it looks like sitting across the table from someone you love who is being consumed by something you can't name. We talked about sacred anger, why it was suppressed, why it was never supposed to be, and why it is one of the most powerful forces available to anyone serious about walking in authority and setting captives free. And I gave you my family, my truth, my sister, my nephew, my mother, my own darkness, and the Sunday that changed our lineage forever. I didn't share that lightly. I shared it because you deserve the real thing. Not a cleaned up version, not a testimony with the hard parts removed, the real thing. Because that's what actually helps people. That's what makes someone listening alone in their car or in their kitchen say, shit, that's my family. That's me. Maybe there's a way through this. There is a way through. I'm living proof, and so is my nephew and my mother and my daughter and every generation that comes after us now. But we're not done. Part 2 of this episode is coming, and it is going to be unlike anything I've done on this podcast before. You're going to hear directly from the people inside the story, my mother and my nephew Devin, their voices, their experiences, their testimony from inside the lineage that was free. I will also be giving my testimony of the battles that I had inside this bondage, because I can tell you what happened, but hearing it from others also who have lived it, that's going to do something different in you. So if this episode stirred something, let it stir. Don't rush to resolve it. Sit with what came up. Look at your own family with new eyes. Ask the questions you've been afraid to ask, and come back for part 2 next week. Until next time, may your path be aligned, your gnosis be clear, and the veil be ever thin. Our journey continues. Thank you for all the love and support. I love you, I see you, and none of us are left behind in this journey together.